there is something that has been of concern when you follow through the current demonstrations that are staged by the Gen Zs in this country. And of course, one word that can't be failed to be mentioned whenever you mention the demonstrations is the name of the International Monetary Fund, that is the IMF, and other concessional lending institutions. The IMF, of course, is an international lender that has lent money to Kenya over the years, and Kenya's current credit outstanding as at this year 2024 is at 2.5 billion that is owed to the IMF. And the IMF in Africa alone is a lending institution to about 21 countries in Africa. Welcome to the Bold Analysis. My name is Frank Oduor. In the run-up to the 2022 general elections, the current president of Kenya, President Ruto, was on record and a section of his allies propagating attacks against the then president Uhuru Kenyatta over his borrowing appetite in order to service the economy.
What Kibaki did, you do not need rocket science. You need to allow enterprise to thrive. You need to get the police out of managing the economy. You need to get more people with jobs so that they can pay taxes. You need to create more enterprises at the local level so that they can pay tax. You need to get the tax regime right, fair, balanced, and equitable. And I hear you, DP. And I hear you, DP. And I have given you a plan on how to raise an extra 600 billion shillings
Take this moment
from the debt plan issue. I have.
Take this moment on the debt issue to speak to more than 160,000 Kenyans that had signed an online petition asking IMF not to give us loans.
Kenyans are entitled. This is a democratic country, you know, and Kenyans have opinions. Kenyans are free to air their views. I am sure the IMF took into account what the Kenyans had to say. I am sure the management of our economy understand, the people managing our economy today understand that Kenyans are concerned. I am concerned as well, and that is why I am saying, rather than spend the last 4 years working on trying to remake the constitution, in my opinion, the priority should have been implementing the Big Four plan that would create more jobs so that people can pay tax, that would create more enterprise so that we can collect more tax, and ensure that we roll out on the NSSF Act of 2013 to make sure that we create a bigger pool of savings so that we have sufficient resources built from our taxes to be able to service our debt. You know, I have given you that plan. And in my very honest opinion, I think we should. If we had taken the Big Four plan and implemented it, we wouldn't be having this discussion. I'm telling you. It is just that the priorities changed and we took time. I'm sure there must be some wisdom in trying to change the constitution. I do not think from where I sit the constitution has a problem.
And according to Ruto and his allies by then, he said and convinced Kenyans that when you create job employment opportunities to the people and give it to them, then you automatically stand to tax them rather than borrow to overburden the budget.
It is high time the country gets the priority right. If a woman who never even went to school, who understands that our family members have gone for 3 or 4 days without a meal, if this woman gets some money, even if it's 1,000 shillings, she will not go to the salon, but she will buy food because that is the priority of her household. This this country where our priorities, our economy is crumbling. We owe foreign countries debts, a lot of money. Kwa hivyo kama tuko na pesa ya kutosha, tulipe hata ile madeni ya Mchina ambayo tulichukua tukajengea barabara. Kama tuko na pesa ya kutosha, COVID imekuja kuharibu uchumi, tulipie karo ya shule ya wanafunzi kuanzia Januari mpaka Disemba, ndio uchumi wao ilikuwa mzuri kule mbele, ndio waanze kulipa pesa ya pale ndani. Kama Kenya iko na pesa ya kutosha, waje tutumie hiyo pesa kuboresha maisha ya Wakenya, kwa sababu mimi mwenyewe kama kuna vipengele katika ile BBI ambayo ni mzuri, niko tayari kama mbunge kupitisha hata bila kuongeza koma yoyote hapa. Na mambo ya kusema kwamba wapende wasipende, hiyo isitumike. The work of government is to process the will of Kenyan people and put it on a level playing field so that Kenyans themselves can decide if it's a good document or it's not a good document.
But now, 2 years later, or about 3 years later into office, the opposite is true. Because Ruto is on the record, together with his administration, as having borrowed immensely from these international lending institutions in order to finance the country's budget. Of course, the president has been going around the world campaigning for the developed countries that contribute so much to IMF to restructure their loans in order to favor the African countries. This is a call that, of course, is of course good to we, the citizens of the African countries that are overburdened by this loan from this International Monetary Fund. You know, every time that we speak of the economy and taxes, all that mention it, IMF name does not fail to feature. And of course, I want us to recognize one thing, that you know, IMF is not entirely the only cause of the mismanagement of this economy or the only cause to the unrest that is currently being witnessed, particularly in regard to the Finance Bill 2024, in as much as they are also the cause to this. Of course, we have other issues such as corruption and expenditure issues and poor economic management that are really dragging us down. I just want us to have a candid conversation, not an analysis sort of, but how can we get out of these IMF traps and these other developed countries traps that they are using these international lending institutions in order to overburden us. You know, I'd stated to you that about 21 African countries are members of the IMF. And of course, there was some time that the new leader of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore, there were reports of how he rejected the lending authority or the lending request from IMF to give his country some money in order to drive some sectors of the economy, saying that these are the very institutions that have always overburdened Africans with interest rates that are not fair to the African countries. The terms and conditions under which they give us their loans are not just fair. And you even had it during that interview roundtable with members of the Fourth Estate in State House, when Ruto was asked a question about IMF and its proposals to Kenya. And following closely, there was something that he seemed to have admitted, that you know, a majority of the contents within the Finance Bill 2024-2025 are a raft of proposals from the IMF. Of course, he said that he had to veto some in order to go through. But you look keenly at that document, then you say, these are proposals of the International Monetary Fund, because they are already seeing that we are at a situation that we seem not to be able to be managing our public debt, and sooner or later, our economy might become unserviceable. Because the new data from the Treasury and the Central Bank CBK place currently Kenya's debt stock at 10.189 trillion. That is something like around 0.3 billion dollars. That is in contrast to the 8.5 trillion that we owed in the past financial year. But I've been looking at this IMF thing, this International Monetary Fund thing. You know, some of the reasons as to why it was formed at its formation is that it was to help meet debt obligations at the help countries meet their debt obligations. That is financing these countries in order to raise money in order to service their economies. But whatever has been happening is that they've been pushing countries like Kenya to meet their debt obligations at the expense of suffering citizens. Because look at some of the proposals in the Finance Bill 2024, and they were even read before Parliament by the Cabinet Secretary in charge of Finance and National Planning, that for the next 1 year, ministries, state departments and agencies will freeze on employment for at least 1 year in order to consolidate the physical debt. But you see, these are just at the expenses of the very suffering citizens, because instead of this International Monetary Fund and other international lending institution advising a government like ours here in Kenya to instead cut on its expenditure, that is on recurrent expenditure, they are advising them to burden the citizen with the taxes, to make the environment of citizens unattainable to live in. Because if you want to tell me that the government will not recruit for the 1 year, yes, it's good. It's a good physical policy. But then you look at the situation of Kenya. Many people are jobless. And as a matter of fact, you know, the informal sector only takes about 35% of employment in this country, meaning that the rest of about 65% is left to the government. So if you freeze employment on these government, state agencies and ministries, then where do you expect the other Kenyans to go? When at a time, the taxation proposals that are being proposed by bodies such as the IMF are the very factors that are chasing the informal sector away from our economy. And you try to look at these problems facing the IMF, then you see it's something that has the input of other superpower countries or other superior countries within the world. Because when it was formed with an aim of meeting or giving these other underdeveloped countries or even developed countries loans, but then they later came out with some proposals or some mandates that they gave to IMF that IMF is not able to tackle clearly. You look at an issue of climate having been sneaked there as some of the roles and mandates of the IMF, digitalization of economies, looking into gender of economies and governance. So this climate thing, I tend to have a problem with it, just the same way the former president of United States of America, Donald Trump, used to have an issue with it. You know, he used to look at this climate change thing as just something that is used in order to get some money somewhere, meant to make some people suffer. And you could even see that he even worked out of some climate change pacts and agreements. So this climate change thing that IMF has been given, you can clearly see, and if you come to think of it, seems to be a modern tool of colonialism. And IMF, by very fact, seems to be a modern tool of colonialism, because a majority of the countries that they target are countries that are struggling in a way, and countries that are not well off. And after giving them these rafts, you look at some of the proposals, then say, maybe some of these proposals are meant to make our economy unserviceable, such that we can always be depending on them, such that we can always be at their mercy. Something that is not very good for our economy. So that thing, that idea that I was sharing with you, that the government will now freeze on employment for the next 1 year. You look at a police department, at a state department such as the National Police Service. The last financial year, it did not recruit. Then this year is also standing not to recruit. Then these are the very institutions that are offering alternative employment opportunities for the majority of the youths who have completed school and now have nothing to do. Then what do you expect in return? Isn't it that our crime rates are going to be on the rise? They're going to be on the increase if we don't look at these very particular things. So we must be honest. In as much as IMF is funding us, they must be honest with us. We must be also honest with ourselves, and we must also, the government must also be honest with the citizens. You know, a case in Kenya and even Africa in general, and especially among the countries that depend on these IMF consensual facilities, is that debt service exceeds currently our expenditure on health, which is among the basic factors, on education, climate, and social services. Just debt servicing. The other time, you had the minister or the cabinet secretary in charge of finance saying that out of every 10 shillings that we collect as taxes, about 6 shillings or so goes to debt servicing. This is very, very unfortunate for our country. And you know, at the formation of IMF, the founding countries or member countries had the conception or the idea that they'll be contributing to about 3% of global economy. IMF would be contributing to about 3% of the global economy, but as things stands right now, it is true that IMF is only contributing about 1% of the global economy, because the member countries have also refused to give financing that is adequate to IMF in order for IMF to tackle some of its mandates as at its conception, as at it had visioned, at its conception, So, those are some of the problems that are facing IMF. And also, you see, some of these rich countries, they've been trying to provide, they've refused rather to provide sufficient funds to IMF. If in the event that they provide sufficient funds to IMF, then it will mean that IMF will not be pressed in order to be pressing countries like Kenya in order to pay back their debts, which might not be alarming, because if we owe them 2.5 billion really, and we're feeling the pinch, just 2.5 billion alone, that is even below what our budget in a single financial year is. Seems like a third or a quarter of it. So, and that is when we are now feeling the pressure of IMF on our backs. Then these countries have to be honest with us. Another thing, these countries, they have to surrender the control and management of IMF and make IMF more democratic and accountable. You know, instead of using IMF to see him as a modern colonialism tool, they should just make it democratic. Let IMF be an honest body that is honest with the citizens of the country. And also, as a country ourselves, Kenya, we should ensure that we put in place prudent use of what we collect. You know, taxes, paying taxes. It is not that citizens don't want to pay taxes. We have to pay taxes in order to finance the government. We have to pay taxes. But if we are paying taxes and these taxes are not being put into prudent use, then this paying of taxes is as good as none. So we have to be making prudent use of these taxes, of what we collect, in order to finance our budget. And to some extent, personally, this is a personal opinion, I feel that some of these grants that we are given by some of these developed countries, they're just aimed at promoting some of the vices. Because if we are reporting that corruption indices are higher, for example, in Kenya, why would a country like the US give us grants in order to combat corruption? If we are not combating corruption with the little we have, why do you need to give us a grant to combat the very same corruption? Then after that, you come to us with proposals or concessional proposals that you want IMF to give us some loans. You know, of course, sometimes within this year, IMF was to issue a report on its current economic relations, on what it wants from Kenya, what Kenya owes from it, and Kenya's physical position in relation to its debt. And you know, there was this lie that was found in the report that they gave. They said in some sector, some line of the report that, you know, Kenya's economy has had a deceleration of about 5.1% in inflation. That was not true reflection, because just sometime after they issued this, that was at around 11th of June this year, sometimes back in May 2024, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, which is a body that is mandated with collecting the statistics of the performance of some of the key sectors of this economy, issued a report and said that instead our inflation increased by about 5.1%. You know, what IMF was telling us that their decrease report was a result of or being aided by a drop in food and fuel prices, when in reality it is not true that food prices have fallen below the levels that IMF had imagined. The food prices, some are falling, but some keep on rising. So I just feel that this IMF thing, we need to have a sober and candid discussion about it and not use it as a modern tool of extending colonial powers over Africa and even Kenya in particular. Thank you for watching.